Rick Crusher. Dalton was a big man, with a rough and intimidating look. His leather jacket clung to his broad shoulders, and his thick beard hid half of his smirk. His gang of bikers respected him as their leader, the one who always had a new joke, a wild challenge, or a way to prove their toughness. They admired him because he was the toughest guy around, or so he made them believe. One sunny afternoon, they rolled into a small, quiet town, looking for a place to relax, maybe stir things up a little. The sun was shining, the streets were calm, and it seemed like the perfect place to have some fun. As they parked their roaring motorcycles in front of a cozy little cafe, the townsfolk turned their heads, their peaceful world suddenly interrupted by the arrival of these tough bikers. People sitting outside lowered their heads, hoping the gang would just pass through. But Rick had other plans. He liked attention. He thrived on making people nervous, laughing loudly, and proving that nobody could mess with him. This small town was no different. He looked around, seeking his next opportunity to show off. His eyes caught sight of two well-groomed dogs sitting near the entrance of the cafe, their calm demeanor almost out of place in the sea of rough bikers. One was a golden retriever with kind, gentle eyes, and the other was a muscular black and tan Doberman, sitting tall and alert, their postures perfect. Rick nudged one of his friends, chuckling. "Look at these fancy little pets," he said with a grin. "They look like they're living a better life than us." His gang laughed along with him, but Rick's eyes narrowed as he thought of a way to entertain himself. He figured it would be funny to startle the dogs, to make them jump and add a bit of excitement to the peaceful town. Without a second thought, Rick lifted his heavy boot and lightly kicked the side of the golden retriever, just enough to startle the dog, but not to cause real harm. The dog let out a surprised yelp, stumbling back in confusion and fear. The Doberman immediately stood up, alert and protective, but it was well trained enough not to attack. A hushed silence fell over the street. People at the cafe gasped in shock, some dropping their trays or looking away in embarrassment. A child holding an ice cream cone squeezed it too hard, and the scoop fell to the ground. The atmosphere was heavy with tension. Rick laughed, pleased with himself. His gang chuckled nervously, unsure whether they should join in or back away. One of them whispered, "Maybe that wasn't such a good idea." But Rick wasn't worried. It was just a dog, after all. Just a little fun. What Rick didn't realize was that the dogs belonged to someone who wasn't like the others. The dogs were owned by Jason Statham. Inside the cafe, a man sat quietly at a table near the window, enjoying a cup of tea. His sharp, strong face betrayed little emotion, but his eyes were different. They were sharp and observant, taking in everything around him, even the peaceful atmosphere of the small town. When he heard the yelp of his dog, his hand froze, the teacup suspended midair. Jason's eyes locked onto the man responsible, the biker standing there, laughing as if the incident meant nothing. The cafe owner, an older gentleman with kind eyes, had also seen what had happened. His face paled as he realized the gravity of the situation. He quickly stepped closer to Jason and whispered, "Sir, I think that biker just made a huge mistake." Jason didn't respond. He didn't need to. He simply stood up, his movements calm and controlled, his presence alone enough to command attention. People inside the cafe exchanged nervous glances. They knew who Jason was. His films, his real-life skills in combat and discipline had made him famous. But what they didn't know was that Jason wasn't just an actor. He was a man who had spent years perfecting the art of handling situations just like this. Jason Statham stepped outside the cafe, the quiet click of his boots against the wooden deck echoing in the now silent street. The once peaceful scene had shifted, and all eyes were on him as he walked towards the bikers, his gaze locked onto Rick. The gang was still standing there, nervously laughing, but something in the way the townsfolk were reacting, expecting something, made them uneasy. One of the younger bikers, his voice low, muttered to Rick, "I think we should leave." Rick frowned. Leave? Over what? He scoffed, shrugging off the suggestion. It was just a joke, relax. But the laughter among the gang had already started to fade, and Rick could feel a subtle shift in the atmosphere. People were watching closely now. It wasn't just fear, it was anticipation. And for the first time that day, Rick felt a twinge of unease deep in his gut. Jason didn't rush. He walked slowly, his every movement controlled, and his eyes never left Rick's. There was no anger in his face, just a quiet, dangerous calm that seemed to draw every bit of attention toward him. The town was completely still. Rick, who had always thrived on being the toughest, couldn't help but feel a small flicker of doubt. Jason wasn't like anyone he had ever faced before. This man didn't need to speak loudly or threaten. His presence alone was enough to make Rick's confidence start to crumble. Rick stood his ground, still trying to appear tough. His arms were crossed, but he could feel the stiffness in his posture. Something was different about Jason, something he couldn't quite place. Jason stopped just a few feet away from Rick, studying him with piercing eyes. "You kicked my dog," Jason said, his voice calm but carrying an undeniable weight, like a storm building in the distance. Rick scoffed and waved him off. "It was just a little tap, mate. Relax." He tried to laugh it off, but his voice was strained. His gang didn't join in this time. They were all too nervous, unsure of what would happen next. Jason didn't flinch, his eyes never leaving Rick. "You think it's funny?" he asked, his tone still steady, still controlled. Rick shifted his weight, trying to regain some of his earlier bravado. "Look, I didn't mean anything by it," he said, the words not quite convincing even to himself. He could feel the eyes of the townspeople on him now, watching intently. His gang was still behind him, but they were more hesitant than ever. For the first time, Rick felt like he was standing alone. Jason tilted his head slightly, considering Rick's words. Then, without any warning, he took one step closer. Rick's heart skipped a beat. The man's calm presence was now dangerously close, and the tension in the air was thick. Before Rick could react, Jason moved again. It was fast, too fast. 1 second, Rick was standing, towering over the man, and the next his balance was gone. Jason had simply stepped in, planting his foot just the right spot to sweep Rick's leg out from under him. Rick hit the ground with a loud thud, the wind knocked out of him, his gang gasping in shock. The leader of the bikers, the toughest guy in the gang, was suddenly on the ground, blinking in confusion. He scrambled to his feet, his face flushed with embarrassment. His gang stood frozen, unsure whether they should jump in or stay back. Jason didn't smile, didn't gloat. He simply stood there, looking down at Rick with the same calm expression. "Not so funny now, is it?" he said quietly. Rick staggered to his feet, his face red with humiliation. He had never been knocked down so easily before, especially not in front of his gang. He clenched his fists, trying to shake off the shock, and glared at Jason, his pride burning. "I'm not done," Rick growled, still trying to sound tough, but there was a noticeable crack in his voice. "You think you can embarrass me like that and walk away?" He squared his shoulders, stepping forward, his hands tight into fists. Jason didn't move. His eyes were locked onto Rick's, still calm, still controlled. "You want to try again?" Jason asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Rick didn't hesitate this time. He swung his fist, aiming straight for Jason's face. But Jason was faster, much faster. Before Rick could even get close, Jason sidestepped effortlessly, grabbing Rick's wrist and twisting it just enough to make him lose control. In one fluid motion, Jason turned Rick's own momentum against him, pulling him forward and sending him crashing into a wooden table nearby. The table splintered under Rick's weight, plates and cups flying everywhere. Rick groaned, trying to get up, but Jason was already standing over him. "Still having fun?" Jason asked, his tone just as calm, just as controlled. Rick's gang stared in disbelief, unsure what to do. Their fearless leader, the man who had always been the strongest, was now lying on the ground, groaning in pain. The townspeople who had been watching in shock couldn't help but smile. They had never seen anything like this before. Rick tried to push himself up, but his body felt weak. For the first time in his life, he realized that he wasn't the toughest man in the room. Jason stood there, his gaze never leaving Rick, waiting for him to make his next move. Rick struggled to get back on his feet, his chest aching from the blow to his pride and body. He was a man who had spent his life intimidating others, believing that no one could ever stand up to him. But now faced with the calm, measured power of Jason Statham, all of that confidence seemed like nothing more than a facade. As Rick stood there, gasping for breath, his hands clutching his chest where Jason had struck him, he felt the full weight of his situation. His gang, his loyal followers, watched silently behind him. Their leader had been reduced to this, a man humiliated in front of the very people he had tried to control. "You're done, Rick," one of the bikers muttered, stepping back. It was the first sign of doubt from his gang. They had always followed him unquestioningly, but now they saw him for what he was. Just a man, not invincible. Slowly, one by one, the bikers started to back away, unsure of how to respond to the situation. Rick could feel his pride cracking, and it stung worse than any physical blow he had ever taken. But he couldn't back down. Not now, not in front of his gang, not in front of the entire town. In a final act of desperation, Rick reached into his pocket and pulled out a small pocket knife. His hands were shaky, and his breath came in sharp gasps. But he was determined to not look weak. He flicked the blade open and held it out in front of him, his grip tight around the handle. He wasn't going to let Jason get the better of him. The crowd gasped, some stepping back, others whispering anxiously to one another. They all waited, wondering what would happen next. The knife in Rick's hand was a symbol of his last stand, a desperate attempt to regain the power he had lost. But Jason didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He sighed, almost disappointed, and shook his head. "You really don't know when to quit, do you?" he said, his voice still calm, steady as ever. Rick's breath quickened. He lunged forward, aiming the knife straight for Jason's side. But before he could make contact, Jason moved. It was faster than Rick could process. Jason's hand shot out, grabbing Rick's wrist in a firm, controlled grip. In a swift motion, he twisted Rick's arm, forcing him to drop the knife with a sharp clink on the pavement. Rick gasped, his wrist burning with pain. His knees buckled and he almost collapsed under the sudden pressure. Jason didn't apply any more force than necessary. He didn't need to. His control over the situation was total. Jason held Rick's wrist tightly, looking him in the eye, his voice low and steady. "That's how it feels to be helpless," he said. "Now imagine how my dog felt." The words hit Rick like a slap to the face. For the first time in his life, he realized what it was like to be powerless, to have no control over a situation. His earlier bravado, the smirk that had always defined him, was gone. All that remained was a man who had been thoroughly humbled. The townspeople, who had been watching in silence, now exchanged glances, some nodding in approval. The message was clear. Rick had messed with the wrong man. He wasn't just an actor. He wasn't just someone who could be bullied or intimidated. He was someone who had earned the right to stand firm, to show real strength without the need for violence or grand gestures. Jason released Rick's wrist, and the biker leader staggered back, his hands shaking. He looked at his gang, but they were no longer looking at him with respect. Their eyes were filled with uncertainty. They had witnessed their leader fall, and now they weren't sure who they were following anymore. Without a word, Rick took a slow step back. His pride screamed at him to fight, to keep pushing, but a deeper part of him, the part that had learned the hard way, told him that this was over. He had already lost. "Let's go," Rick muttered, not looking at his men. His voice was quieter than it had ever been. One by one, the bikers hesitated, unsure of what to do. But when they saw the look in Rick's eyes, they understood. Their leader had given up. Slowly, they made their way back to their motorcycles. As the sound of the motorcycles revved up and faded into the distance, the town breathed a collective sigh of relief. The tension that had gripped the street lifted. Jason, standing in the midst of the calm that had returned, looked down at his golden retriever, who had approached him, her tail wagging. The Doberman stood alert, keeping watch. Jason bent down and patted his dog's head, satisfied. "Good girl," he murmured softly. The dog's calmness a contrast to the chaos that had just unfolded. The cafe owner, who had watched everything unfold, chuckled softly. "Well, that was quite a show." Jason simply nodded, his expression unchanged. "Some people think strength is about showing off," he said quietly. "But real strength is knowing when to use it and when not to." The elderly woman who had been watching came up to him, a warm smile on her face. "You didn't even have to do much, and you still taught that man a lesson he won't forget," she said. Jason gave a small knowing smile, as though he didn't need to say more. The lesson was already clear to everyone who had witnessed the events. The town, now peaceful once more, returned to its routine. The cafe owner continued serving tea, the children played in the streets, and the townspeople shared quiet conversations. The incident with Rick and his gang would be a story that would be told and retold for years to come. And as the sun began to set, everyone knew that the lesson Jason had taught them would not be forgotten. Strength is not about proving yourself, but about knowing when to step forward and when to remain silent and always being in control of your actions. And as Jason walked back into the cafe, the golden retriever and Doberman by his side, the people of the town knew one thing for sure. They would never forget the day the quiet man came to town and showed them what true strength looked like.